The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Premier for bringing this motion to the House, and I thank the members of the Sudanese community, the Sudanese Cultural Social Society and other community leaders to the Parliament. As the Premier just said, God bless you for being here and bringing attention to the cause of your homeland, your heritage country, and of course the suffering and devastation that your family, loved ones and people you know are facing right now. The Premier in his speech talked about the focus of the world's attention, certainly here in Australia, on Gaza, on Ukraine. We have readily available television images in our homes and on our screens on a regular basis. Many people in our community are familiar with those challenges. Extraordinary suffering faced, of course, by many communities around the world. And yet, the scale, as has been outlined, in which I'll go through in my prepared remarks in a moment, in Sudan is extraordinary. And it is in standing as Deputy Leader of the Opposition alongside the government, as the Opposition does support this motion, as the Federal Liberal Opposition supports the Federal Government in that support which has been provided so far, although, as has been acknowledged, more must be provided. I hope that this will ensure that you are seen and the community's pain is seen, as of course we see the work of the community in our prosperous South Australian multicultural society already. The Sudanese community in South Australia is 1,000 strong. Over the last 25 years, you have enriched our state, coming here and making a contribution. Sudanese community, the census data will tell anyone who's interested, it can be marked through its youth. 50% of the Sudanese community in South Australia are under the age of 35. A significant number of people in primary and secondary education, and also seeking apprentices and skilled qualifications and tertiary study. And of course those in the older categories are making a difference in the way that they contribute through their labour, through their work. Labourers, whether as healthcare professionals and healthcare workers, jobs that we need done in South Australia in all fields of life. Sudanese community is marked by a propensity towards faith, whether Islamic or Christian, of all denominations. And of course that faith, all of us who share a faith find it tested at times. We pray that it will also help people find solace at times of struggle. And we also pray that through people reaching to their faith, they will find a level of peace, a way forward, and that sides that are in conflict can be brought together through that as well. The Premier's motion begins with a note that we can note with concern the rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis caused by the ongoing conflict in Sudan, which has left the country at a catastrophic and cataclysmic breaking point. In April last year, Sudan was utterly thrown into disarray, of course, when its army and the paramilitary groups began this vicious struggle for power that has claimed, we understand, as many as 150,000, perhaps more, lives already, whether through violence, starvation or disease. It's been described as the world's largest displacement crisis. 9 million people forced from their homes. And in April last year, the people in Sudan, the people of Sudan, were not living in the prosperity that we know so well in South Australia. 46 million people living on an average annual income of $750 per person. This conflict, of course, has made things so much worse in the last year. I understand in 2023 alone, the economy shrank by 40%. I can only imagine what further disruption has had. The motion notes the terrible toll that the conflict is having on civilians, with reports indicating more than 150,000 have been killed through violence, starvation and disease, more than 14 million people left with no option but to flee their homes or being forcibly displaced, and widespread and systemic violent acts targeting women and children. When leaving his post in September, I'm advised UN envoy to Sudan, Volker Perthes, accused the RSF of committing sexual violence, looting and killings in areas it controls, and condemned the Sudanese armed forces for indiscriminate aerial bombings. The UN has described the war as triggering the world's worst hunger crisis. Action Against Hunger describes 5 million Sudanese people dealing with emergency levels of hunger. The motion for the House expresses horror at the famine currently underway throughout Sudan, with a staggering 25.6 million people facing acute hunger and fears that up to 2.5 million could die by the end of this year. With 19 months of conflict, almost 80% of health centres in the affected areas are non-functional. The humanitarian toll has been compounded by those human rights violations, those sexual violence violations that were described before. And aid agencies have long been complaining that security threats and roadblocks have greatly hampered their efforts to deliver vital goods like food to people who need them. Food is expensive. Sudan's annual inflation rate surged to 136% in the first half of this year alone. Discussed earlier, the starting point. The motion continues, noting the high risk that the violence will escalate into widespread ethnic cleansing and the broad use of starvation techniques, the escalation of recently reported usage of water and food poisoning, which could lead to the second genocide in Sudan in less than 2 decades. In October, international observers reported fresh evidence of ethnic cleansing in Darfur. Human Rights Watch have said that ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity have been committed against ethnic Masalit and non-Arab communities in the region. It seems clear that civilians in the state are being targeted because of identity. The motion commends the Commonwealth Government's commitment in humanitarian assistance to Sudan, including medical supplies, food, water, sanitation and emergency shelters for the most vulnerable. And since April last year, the Australian Government has provided that range of assistance as described. I'll take a moment to quote from the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Liberal Party's spokesperson on this in Canberra, Senator Simon Birmingham of South Australia, who earlier in the year joined, and I'm quoting from Senator Birmingham, we joined with the government in calling for the parties, the National Army, the Rapid Support Forces and others engaged in the conflict to urgently cease hostilities, to return to negotiations and to settle arrangements to protect the humanitarian assistance that people across Sudan desperately need and deserve. We urge them to continue to work to provide safe passage for those who want to leave areas where fighting is taking place, including Khartoum and Darfur. He went on later to say, we urge the Australian Government and all nations to continue to provide support to ongoing efforts with partners and allies to evacuate Australian citizens. I suspect this part of the speech was a little while ago, and others who need to leave, and to continue to support efforts towards peaceful resolution. We urge the parties within Sudan and their supporters to use any and every opportunity to pursue a peaceful end to the conflict. The motion calls on the Commonwealth to ensure that the continued humanitarian assistance and diplomatic efforts going forward are commensurate with the sheer scale of the unfolding disaster. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has, as the Premier alluded in his speech, called out the international community for not doing enough for the people of Sudan. $2 billion in humanitarian funding received by Sudan since the war began in their estimation represents under 50% of the funding required. There is clearly more to do, and the international community must work together. The motion concludes expressing our support for our Sudanese South Australians, many of whom have family and friends in Sudan who are suffering or are affected by this catastrophe. I'll add to my earlier words the greetings, the condolences, the best wishes of the Leader of the Opposition, Vincent Tarzia, and the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, the Honourable Jing Lee, MLC, and indeed the entire Liberal parliamentary team. I'm sure that in addition to the government who are speaking, the Liberal Party, also the crossbench, will join us in supporting this motion, which will have the wholehearted support of the entire House.